welcome to this episode of Psychedelics Today with Bennet Zelner, back for his third episode, and Rachelle Sampson, making your first appearance on the show. Really beautiful to have both of you here. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks
Thank
so
you, David.
much.
We've got some pretty awesome stuff to talk about, particularly around the study that you're working on around connected leadership. Before we dive in your own words, just tell folks a wee bit about yourselves personally, professionally, and kind of where this psychedelic kind of topic and field of study kind of came into your lives. Maybe Bennet, could I ask you to go first?
Sure. Well, as you said, my name is Bennet Zelner, and I'm honored to be here for my third time. I'm a business school professor at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, and Rachelle and I are colleagues there. I'm trained basically as a business economist, and just to answer your question about kind of my path and kind of how psychedelics became part of it, I spent the first part of my career doing more traditional sorts of business school economics research, and didn't feel very connected to the work. And about 10 years ago, I had this kind of epiphany where I realized that the reason I felt so disconnected from my work is that I was studying the economic system, which is itself very dysfunctional. So there's a sense in which I was kind of furthering this dysfunctional system. And I had some assistance from plant allies in reaching that, and kind of surfacing that insight, which I think I already knew, but surfacing it meant kind of questioning my entire identity. So I continued to listen to and work with the plants, and I became very interested in what I actually didn't know about this. There's an area, a field called regenerative economics. It's an emergent field. It comes more from systems theory than from economics itself. And it basically focuses on how we might be able to apply the patterns and principles of nature to socioeconomic systems. And I had started to have a lot of ideas related to this field during my experiences, although, as I said, I didn't actually know it was a field at the time. So things kind of moved forward, and I started working, started kind of shifting my research and just the way I thought about things into this domain of regenerative economics. And Rachelle and I were in conversation. We've known each other for decades. Rachelle was the one who originally recruited me to the University of Maryland, and we met in grad school many years ago, although we didn't go to the same grad school. Yeah, and where I was at the time, I was trying to think about how I could kind of maximize my impact, given that I was a business school professor and kind of the resources at my disposal as a result of that. And to me, it seemed like I could have the largest impact by kind of maybe helping to try to facilitate the same kind of expansion of consciousness that I had in leaders, in folks who might be capable of helping us navigate toward a regenerative future. And so that was, for me, that was the genesis of the study. And I know Rachelle has her own kind of her own path. So maybe I'll just turn it over to Rachelle, and she can talk a bit about her journey as well.
Yeah, thanks, Bennet. And thank you, David. It's a delight to be here with you and having this conversation. So my name is Rachelle Sampson, and as Bennet said, I'm also on the faculty at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. I'm also trained as a business economist and as a lawyer. So that was the early part of my career, was being an attorney and consultant, fairly traditional business stuff before I came back for my doctorate and starting my academic career, which started pretty traditionally, teaching in business schools, doing research on research and development, innovation, collaboration between firms and the like. And I had always been very interested. I'm very much an outdoors person, so I have a deep connection with nature. And was very aware of what was going on in not just in climate, but around deforestation and loss of species, and all of the changes that we're seeing that have been devastating to the ecosystem and also pose threats, but also just destroying this beauty that is there, and we are a part of. So I became very interested in, well, how can, businesses harness market forces to sort of create change in those places. And so I started doing, maybe 15, 20 years ago, a bunch of teaching and research around exactly that. So how can firms engage in, say, more sustainable practices and, say, more of a kind of the circular economy or cradle to cradle manufacturing, which are very similar to these kinds of living systems ideas that Bennet was touching on just a moment ago, and do well, right, for their organizations, be thriving places to work, serve their employees well, right? And, my thinking at the time, naive though it was, if I had just presented the best research and all this information to companies, that they would be like, oh, well, of course, we're going to adopt that. But of course, we know that that's not how change happens. And it's a messy process. It's a very human process. And so I had worked with organizations, leaders, even leaders who really wanted to make these changes, who were really frustrated about the inability to kind of make these shifts. And there were a whole myriad of reasons why that was coming up. Lots of kind of finger pointing. It's the investors, it's the managers, it's the customers, it's, all of these different parties were responsible. But then enter in kind of, I was exposed to psychedelics and seeing the research and the power of them, in terms of shifting people's awareness and perceptions, and particularly perceptions around being connected to themselves, others, the natural world. It's like, oh, I wonder what would happen if we brought these two worlds together, right? Because there's stuckness around making these shifts to kind of more pro-social business, pro-environmental, to be more integrated in a natural way, right, with the ecosystem. And so after that sort of arose for me, Ben and I started having conversations of, well, what would this look like? How could we do this and bring this into leadership? And that's really for me where this all came from, is, just this deep interest, abiding interest in creating more equitable organizations, but also ones that work in harmony with our natural environment of which we're part. And so I was really curious whether this was a possibility.
All right. Thank you, Rachelle. So let's dive in. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of a provocative question. So I used to be an economist. That's what I studied at college in England. I was electrocuted and then kind of, became a social worker and left that field. And I remember from my studies, there's microeconomics, there's studies of businesses, consumers, producers, and then macroeconomics, governments and kind of world trade organizations, things like that. Why are you choosing, in a sense, to focus on the microeconomic piece of leaders, of businesses, of teams and decision-making, rather than the macroeconomics, which is governments and, the actual capitalist system itself? And part of my question is because I'm a little bit skeptical. Can capitalism actually become conscious and more connected? Is it possible to evolve the systems that we're all part of from the bottom up rather than the top down by working with governments and policy and kind of, multinational trade agreements and things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of places to dive in there.
It's a provocative question. Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Do you want to
Please take the bait?
Do you want to start? Do you want to start, Rachelle, or do you want me to?
I'm happy either way. Well, okay.
Well,
So let me dive into that. So just putting on my kind of sort of systems hat and things like that. And when I think about change, all of the parties are required, right? There's no magic solution, single magic solution that's going to solve everything, right? I'm a firm believer in that. However, the perspective that I hold on how shifts and change happens is that, it starts pretty organically at the individual and then the community level and then grows out. Now, those individuals could be leaders, in which case they have more influence, right? And when they make decisions, more things happen, right? And they have uh, potentially more opportunity to do that. But the reality is that it's very difficult to force change just from kind of, starting at this top down level, because of the embedding in the systems and being part of these systems. The systems are very strong. And, it's one of the kind of benefits, especially if you're in a healthy system, that's what makes it resilient, right? Is that it's not going to change on a dime, right? Just because there's been a disruption in the system somewhere. Um, However, if the system is dysfunctional and you want some kind of change and movement, then the system becomes harder to move. Starting in at the strong places where they're strongest, like the governments, trade organizations, things like that, it's a really difficult place to start. And let me just give credit. There are people doing amazing work in those organizations, right? And who are deeply committed to service and, doing the right thing, as it were, for humanity, ecosystems, etc. But the question that I hold and the belief that I hold from what I have seen is that the change starts individually, the shifts start individually, and then they start rippling out from there. And we can talk about that process, but that is an embedded element of systems change, like how systems respond. And I know Bennet has great, sort of thinking and language around this, about how this individual characteristic and shifts can lead to systems change. And so actually, let me tee that up. Bennet, do you want to lean in on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, I just want to say I agree. I think, Rachelle, what you just said is just so spot on, and I agree with every word. So yeah, I'll just maybe embellish a little bit. And I guess since we're having this very meta level conversation, we can talk about I'm going to introduce two concepts. And the first is the concept of emergence, which some people may already be familiar with, some listeners may already be familiar with. And emergence refers to a property of a system that can't be directed or even envisioned by by any individual system member alone. So it reflects the behavior of all the participants in the system, but is beyond the ability of any one member to direct or envision. So the example I always use for this is a flock of birds. So a flock of birds has this coherence to it. It's got a beautiful shape, and it flies in a specific direction and a specific speed. There's no one bird that's directing that, or that could even imagine what that whole pattern is going to look like. The pattern instead reflects the behavior of the individual birds who have this kind of built-in sense, what I refer to as an attunement, that leads them to behave in a certain way. They're also able to coordinate with each other in a nonverbal way. All right. So we got this concept of emergence. We can also add to that the concept of emergent change. So emergent change happens when the individual participants in the system shift their individual behaviors, leading them to self-organize into a new pattern. So the flock of birds can change its speed, it can change its direction, it can fly south for the winter. And again, it does that all without being commanded by some authoritative central bird actor. There's no bird in chief. That's kind of the equivalent of the governments and the macro institutions you were talking about. The change happens because the individual birds all shift their behavior. So that's kind of the theory of change. I think that's actually the only way that change can happen in complex systems. It can't happen in a top-down way. Again, as Rachelle said, if there are certain actors who in the current configuration of the system have more influence over other actors, maybe they can help to speed it up, but it still comes down to what's in here. And I'll just add one quick other, I said I would introduce two concepts, or I guess I really meant three. So I referred before to this idea of attunement. So our attunement is the way that we orient to the world, right? It's basically the way that we navigate. Humans have an attunement as well. Attunement is defined as the way that we orient to the world. And the prevailing attunement of our culture is what's been referred to as a technological attunement or a mechanistic attunement, in which we tend to focus on systems in terms of their component parts to the neglect of the interactions among these parts. And I would argue that a lot of the systemic crises that we now face, ecological, social, economic, can be traced at some level to this mechanistic attunement, this neglect of systemic interactions and consequences. So if we really want to see systems change, I would argue that what really needs to happen is a shift in attunement, a shift from this mechanistic attunement to what we might call a synergistic attunement, a way of orienting to the world in which we recognize in a deeply embodied way the intrinsic interconnectedness of all things and beings and the mutuality of the relationships that support life. And you had asked this question initially, you had said, what I heard was, what are the levers? What are the most powerful levers for change? And you would propose maybe we should be focusing on these organizations at the top. If I had to put my money on it, I think the most powerful lever for change is this internal change, the shift in attunement, which, if it were to occur, would then lead society, and maybe this sounds very utopian, but would lead us to self-organize into a new pattern, ideally a new, more regenerative pattern.
Yeah. And if I can just hop on that just for a moment too, if you think about even taking this out of the context of leaders, we think about, someone who has a fairly deep process of shifting within themselves. They show up differently in the world. They start interacting with 5 people differently. Those 5 people start responding to them differently. Some of them might even be curious and start moving in that direction, right? It can move in both directions, right? Then those 5 people touch 5 other people. And, this is the process of this kind of grassroots change. And if you look at like social movements and things like that, it's always come that way. It's never been from the top down. The government is the last responder. They are responding to what's going on in the populations and reflecting that rather than, from the top down perspective. And so in many ways, it's like that Margaret Mead comment, never doubt that a dedicated group of, small number of individuals can make change. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'm going to hop on and add one more point to that as well, which is that if you look at models of social network dynamics, specifically in models of how an idea or a belief spreads throughout a population, you don't need to. I mean, ideally, you'd like to reach 100% of the population, but you actually don't need to set that as your target. You need to reach about 20 to 20. An idea or a belief needs to reach about 20 to 25% of the population, and then it hits a tipping point, and the spread of that idea or belief throughout the population then becomes exponential. And it's because of this kind of peer influence, the social influence sort of effect that Rachelle was talking about. So I think that's useful to keep in mind, because it's still a lot of people, but it seems a lot more manageable, seems more feasible to reach 20 to 25% than to set your sights on we have to reach 100% or nothing will ever change.
Well, yeah. And also, just to be clear on that too, it's not about like imposing a change on an individual. It's providing, the idea is, and the theories behind this are, it's providing a context and a container. And this is where the psychedelics come in, for allowing deeper connection with self and awareness of your own intrinsic wholeness, right? And also in that process, so surfacing all the things that come up for us, all the stories we tell ourselves that may or may not be true, right? But it's also this deeper resourcing of what's possible, and what we're actually capable of in terms of creation, and knowing what we want to create and bring forth in the world, right? As an act of, just generative possibility, because it's a joy to create, right? And so it is about that kind of return to remembering intrinsic sort of wholeness and resourcefulness and groundedness, and that's where it comes from. So it's an invitation to that, and I think that's why it can be such a powerful, um, this kind of contagion or spread effect, because people are starting to show up in ways that feel very different and feel very healthy, and that's very attractive. And so that's, I think, part of what can catalyze movements. Is there's a feeling of, oh yes, this is resonant. This feels like
Yeah.
my true nature.
Yeah. Now I've got to add one more thing to that too. That's totally. This is.
Maybe you'll get a
I'm glad
question
we're
in one of these
recording this
days.
because we need to write a new paper. So maybe we
You're
get going
welcome.
here. So this idea of a synergistic attunement, this isn't just like Rachelle, as Rachelle was saying, we don't need to just impose this belief on people. If we think about the way this is actually the pattern of life. So think about the human body, for example. There's this myth that the brain is directing everything, and the brain's important, don't get me wrong, but that's actually not how the human body works. The human body is a bunch of cells. Each cell has a sort of attunement, has a sort of way it behaves, and the cells self-organize into a pattern, which is you. So there is something that the synergistic attunement is already within us. It is literally what we are, literally the stuff of life, and the human body. But that same type of behavior happens at every level, up to the universal level.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's not about like imposing this other way of being. It's about rediscovering who and what we truly are.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things that I tell, so I also have a small coaching practice, which I developed in service of this project. I don't coach participants in our study, but I wanted to understand and learn how to coach executives so that I could better understand the study design and kind of what they were working through. And I ended up loving the work, and so have a small practice on the side. But one of the things I always tell my clients, because they're very cerebral people, their brains have gotten them a long way. My brain's gotten me a long way. It's been an enormous service to me. I'm so grateful to it. However, it is only, even if we just talk about the nervous system, it's only one part of our nervous system. And in fact, we take information from like the whole system. Like there's a huge cluster of neurons around our gut and our heart. Most of the serotonin is produced in our gut, one of our major neurotransmitters, right? And so all of this information is coming through here, and the brain is just one part of kind of our nervous system, sort of intelligence, if you will. But the body is actually enormously important. And I think that is one of the critical parts of reconnection that psilocybin seems to have a unique potential for reconnecting people with, is this innate intelligence of the body, which in Western society in particular, we're very cerebral, and it's very easy to ignore everything from here down, right? And I know this because I've been in those places myself, right? And so in that process of reconnection, it can be in fits and starts and not always the most comfortable process, but it is a path to much greater possibility, right? A richer life, more resonance and connection with others, the ability to attune in different ways with ourselves, with nature. And I think that's kind of the curiosity. It's like, if those things are possible, if we see those things, what does happen? How does this translate in the study? And we have so many questions that we're so privileged to be able to work with these very courageous leaders who are stepping in to this program and then enrolling in the study as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. We're going to dive into it, but I just have to say, You know, maybe when you were younger, you played that game with a balloon and you're trying to kind of keep it up in the air and see how many times you can pass it back and forth before it touches the ground. So you two just did that, broke a record, I think. I think that was like 7 or 8 times passing the balloon between the two of you. Brilliant, lovely.
This
And I
is
love
like
that you're
integration for us.
right.
We just came back from this retreat in the Netherlands. I mean, we weren't participating; it was research. But this is this is an integration exercise.
Yeah, it's just the three of us. No worries. So I love how you're connecting the micro, the macro there, particularly around the synergistic attunement. And part of it is that radical change in how we think of where does change come from? Where does transformation come from? And in a sense, to stop waiting for governments and policymakers and, all of the kind of meta level folks to do it. You've chosen to work with, the micro, the leaders, companies, businesses, organizations, kind of grassroots. So let's dive into that connected leadership study. You've mentioned the psilocybin and how effective that is. Could you just describe what this study is? What is it kind of structured, and the format and the design of it in particular?
Yeah, definitely. So, I'll take a start with that. Basically, what it is a cohort of people who are in leadership positions in business organizations, and we don't specify a role per se, because they could be, say, a director of Asia Pacific, or they could be a founder of a small to medium enterprise. They have different titles, different roles, different. The key is that they're making key decisions within the organization. So that's kind of our screen, right? So allocating capital, deciding on strategies, directing teams, there's a lot of different ways that they fall within. And they tend to be fairly senior people who show up. So then what happens is they're basically enrolling in a program. And this time around, what the program entails is there's a retreat at the center, which involves psilocybin in a legal jurisdiction, which is the Netherlands. And there's a marvelous retreat partner named Kiyomi who's facilitating it. They're a professional retreat company. And then we have these two marvelous coaches, Carrie Radcliffe and Luther Kitahata, who are executive coaches, but they also have very deep contemplative practices on their own. So they can kind of walk in both worlds, if you will. And what they're doing is coaching one-on-one with these participants before and after the retreat. So kind of a preparation, a deepening, and then sort of this unfoldment practice afterwards of how does that actually translate? Because that's one of the tricks. It's not just this personal development, although that's obviously an essential part, but they both understand how this translates into their worlds, because they live in those business worlds. They know the kinds of pressures that they're under and the decisions that they're facing. So that's kind of the program. So then Bennet and I come in as sort of observers, as researchers in this program. So participants have chosen to enroll, and then we invite them, if they choose, it's optional, to enroll in the research study. And as part of the research study, what we do is we do all the things that you might expect. We do lots of measurement before, during, after the retreat. And we do that both quantitatively through various psychometric scales and things, so that we can understand where they're coming in from. So we can kind of stratify the data, you might say. So these people have had experiences before with psychedelics, these people have not. Those sort of starting conditions. And so we need to have kind of a lay of the land. And then we do, interviews at the beginning. We do interviews right after the experience, so we can better understand the nature of their experience during the retreat. And then we do follow-ups. And one of the unique things about our study is, so the program will last about 2 months after the retreat itself, like the coaching, and there's some group sessions as well, where there's some regenerative practices and concepts that are brought in. But we follow them for a year afterwards as part of the study, because it's long-term in most of the psychedelic studies has been maybe 3 months. There aren't a lot of long-term follow-ups, and this is generally true, and it's costly. There's a lot of reasons for that. But we can, and because what we're measuring is sort of qualitative through interviews and psychometric studies and surveys, we get to see what the arc looks like over a longer period of time. And, because things don't immediately happen, these shifts might be 1 degree. It's sort of like a ship in the ocean, make a 1 degree turn. In the short run, you're not really seeing a lot of change, right? You're still kind of in the rough, same geographic area. But if you follow that over 6 months, they're going to end up on a different continent, right? So, and that's sort of the idea, is that we want to see over time how this actually unfolds. And we learned so much from the pilot in terms of the qualitative differences and what this looks like. That's why we really feel like the qualitative component and the long-term follow-up is extremely important. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of the rough sketch of what the study and the program that's underneath it looks like.
Did you mention how many psilocybin ceremonies there were?
We didn't. There are two.
Two.
Go ahead, Bennet.
Okay.
Yeah, no, there are two. There are two, and sometimes when people learn the program, they say, "Well, is this microdosing or it's macro dosing?" So there are two, kind of there are two ceremonies with ceremonial levels of psilocybin. I don't really have much to add to what Rachelle said. I thought that was an awesome description. The only thing I'll talk a little bit more about is the coaching itself. And I think Rachelle already mentioned how incredible these coaches are, and one of the reasons why they're incredible, the fact that they kind of they have this business acumen, and they also have their own kind of contemplative practices. They also are both expert in a coaching modality known as depth coaching or depth-based coaching. And what this type of coaching seeks to do, so actually we can go back to attunements here. Some coaching is based, and I would say some therapy is like this too, reflects the technological or mechanistic attunement. So it's like you're a machine, and we got to fix this part of you. These different parts, there's some parts that are broken or not functioning as efficiently as they could, so let's tweak them. And one issue that one could take with that style of coaching is that, or therapy, is that it assumes that something's wrong with you in the first place. Is transformation really possible when you're working with a method that reflects the attunement of the system that is kind of at issue in the first place? Right. So depth-based coaching, Rachelle mentioned the concept of wholeness earlier. It starts from the recognition that we're all whole. We were born whole. As beings in nature, we are inherently whole. And it seeks to help people reconnect with themselves, to deepen contact with themselves. So if you think back to some of what we're talking about in terms of systems change, and if we also think about what we know about psilocybin, for instance, the research done by Roz Watts and others showing that psilocybin helps reduce clinical symptoms and lead to improvements in well-being by helping people reconnect with themselves, others in the wider world. This type of coaching is really well aligned with the way that psilocybin works. And so that's useful not just for preparing people for their psilocybin ceremonies, but perhaps even more in helping them integrate those experiences. Because Rachelle was talking a bit about the fact that we're doing a much longer follow-up than in many studies. One of the concerns that sometimes is expressed about psilocybin treatment, say for depression, is that somebody might go and have this deep experience of reconnection and feel great relief from their depressive symptoms, and then they re-enter the same alienating environment that may have been potentially contributing to their mental distress in the first place, and the effects will eventually fade. So what depth-based or depth coaching helps you do is expand your own capacity without necessarily using psychedelic substances, expand your own capacity to deepen contact with yourself. So it's a way of helping people potentially re-enter that space they inhabited during the ceremony and stay in touch with their experience during the ceremony. So that's why we hypothesize that this type of coaching will help to increase the durability of the effects of of the psilocybin ceremonies themselves. Okay, so I said that was going to be a quick thing. I kind of went off a bit longer than I meant to, but yeah.
Now let's dig into the data, because I know you've currently are working with a second cohort, but from the first cohort, what kinds of data are you seeing, particularly the longitudinal qualitative data? So the experiences they had on retreat in the Netherlands and kind of downstream, what's changing? I know you said like just moving the dial by 1 degree. So what are we starting to see so far?
It's such a wide variety of experience. It's been kind of amazing and fascinating to watch. So you have everything from people who really downplay their experience, like, oh yeah, not much has happened. But I do notice that when I'm in meetings, I, used to be really triggered by this person, and I just don't get triggered anymore. And I have great clarity about who I'm supposed to work with. And, so it's very interesting how they speak about the experience, is that it's not necessarily a big deal, but it does have a lot of influence over the choices that they're making. And then to the other extreme of, someone in our cohort stepped down from a company that they had founded and built from scratch, um, because they wanted to do something different. And that's what they discovered, that it was time for a change. The company was doing well, it was successful. And so it continued on. But this person decided that they needed to step down from it and do something else. And then to others where they're seeking to expand and very curious about different forms of finance that are less extractive, right? And wanting to learn about that, right? So, and then others who even say that there's less going on, but they're curious to try it again. Like there's something that's kind of opened in them in terms of a curiosity around process. I don't know that there's anyone that we saw in the cohort who was really untouched by it in any way. It's just very different flavors of what it looks like.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer. And in this case, I really don't have much to add. The only thing I'll add is that I think that the qualitative results, the interview, which are based on interviews that we do with the participants, are really compelling, because this is a social science research study. We're also exploring mechanisms, and we administer a battery of psychometric surveys to the participants in order to gain more insight into those mechanisms. And we have a model of different mechanisms might lead to actual changes in real world decision making. And as we gather more data, we'll be able to speak more authoritatively about what the mechanisms look like and publish some results on, kind of a model, if you will, of how psychedelic experiences actually produce or facilitate change in leadership, in leaders, and in decision making.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add something here from our Vital course. I just wrapped up the summer elective with about 40 students that chose the elective that I led with Anna Ray Grabstein about kind of psychedelic business and leadership and careers. And part of the 4-week elective was around self-awareness and inner work, and how that relates to how we show up in our job and our profession, our goals, and our ability to kind of be accountable. And so we got all of the students to do the Myers-Briggs assessment and to look at Daniel Goleman's 6 types of leaders and Edward de Bono's the 6 thinking hats and the 15 commitments of conscious leadership. And it was really interesting in a sense to give our students the opportunity to see how instead of their identity, the hats that they wear, maybe to just bring more light to that, their sense of self and how that shows up, what limitations and kind of roadblocks, obstacles that presents in their life. And in really just being able to have a little bit more choice and kind of deliberate attunement, to use your words, around what values are underlying their decisions and their goals, their missions and their vision. So I know we're wrapping up here, but I'd like to just have a few minutes to talk about, on one hand, there's this depth-based coaching piece, and it sounds like there's quite a lot of inner work and healing, shadow work going on. And at the same time, there's this understanding what are the core values that motivate me and my life, my goals, my career, mission and vision. So how exactly are you, in a sense, extrapolating that on one side, the kind of healing, therapeutic, kind of psychological aspect, and then the other side, which is more, business decision making and how to work with employees and kind of team culture and corporate mission and vision? How do they kind of gel together?
Mm, such a great question. I'm happy to jump in. So, something to with the depth-based coaching, yes, there can be this shadow work, but there's also this work about deeper resourcing and connecting with values, like, and joy, like awareness of who we are, in our deepest selves. And there's also ways of connecting with qualities of presence that are incredibly useful. It's just that it's learning to navigate those things. So take for example a quality of anger, which we typically view as sort of negative, not a great thing, right? So, and sure, if we react to anger with just kind of a spewing out and reacting and attacking others, unless it's a life-threatening situation, right? In which case, maybe that's exactly what's required, is usually not helpful, right? And in fact, is usually the opposite. But anger is telling us something about our values and what's happening to us, right? And anger can actually fuel a source of strength and the ability to, say, assert a boundary, or an awareness that change needs to happen. There's something that's not quite right here, that there's something out of alignment with our values. So all of these things are kind of these signals of exactly the kinds of things that you are talking about, David. What are my values? What's important to me? What are these, feelings, sensations, emotions, thoughts that are coming up? Where is that coming from? And it's this process of getting the space between the signal and the action that is the most important, which I think you were kind of touching on as well, right? So that ability to observe, okay, this is coming up. All right, what is it that's bringing it up for me? Is this just about my history and I'm more sensitive to it? Or is this something that's really here in this situation that isn't quite right or that needs change? And then having that space so choice becomes possible, right? That it's not just a constant reaction. And that is the core of leadership. It's like all leadership begins with self-leadership. You are leading all these facets of ourself. We are very multifaceted beings. We have so many dimensions and depths to our personality. And so it's how can we lead that within ourselves and then show up in that way so that then we can work more effectively with others and resonate and attune.
I love that. Yeah, particularly just around the space of choice and awareness. That's where the magic happens. Awesome. Anything you want to add, Bennett, to that?
I don't really have much to add to that. But I really like the way Rochelle put it. I guess the only thing I would note is that this idea of increasing the space between stimulus and response, I think it was Viktor Frankl who had this kind of famous quote about in the space between stimulus and response lies the ability to choose. I'm not getting the wording exactly right. But at least anecdotally, uh, psychedelics are often psychedelic experiences are often associated with increasing that space. So this all kind of lines up.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
So we're out of time, but before you go, just tell folks about your third cohort, because I believe that's now about to open, if they want to apply for that. And yeah, just other ways that people can find out about your work and to get in touch with yourselves.
Yeah. I think we can supply I assume there'll be notes with the podcast, so we can
Show notes,
supply
yeah.
a link. So the link, uh, So we'll supply a link that has information about the program and the study, including instructions for how to apply. And enrollment for the next cohort is about to open, I would say in the next week or so. The program starts online in October, and then the retreat itself, the retreat itself takes place in the Netherlands in early November. Rachelle, are there any other really key points that you want to add, or?
No, just that recruiting will be ongoing. It is limited to 14 spaces, and if anyone has questions, they should absolutely apply and reach out. And our program lead can be in touch and answer questions about that. And of course, if anyone has questions about the study, they can reach out to Bennett and myself, and we'll give you a link for the study site as well, which is where participants can get more information on participating in the research, which we hope they will too.
Beautiful. Thank you. Really awesome to get a strong feel for what you're working on. I think it's awesome from the ground up. And yeah, working with our leaders, and that maybe we're all leaders as well. That's one other thing I wanted to just explore. What is a leader? And who are the leaders that inspire? So maybe Bennett and Rachelle, thank you for being leaders in the space that are bringing attention to this. And it is empowering, and it is really giving us a sense of space to question, like, where does change happen? So thank you for being change makers. Can't wait to just track how the data unfolds with the new cohort. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the lovely conversation and the opportunity. Greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks everyone for listening. Take care.